Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture for Mastering the National Circuit of Congressional Debate. My name is Nick Ostheimer, and I will be your presenter today. Just a brief introduction. Hi, my name is Nick. I'm ranked #1 in the country by the NSDA for Congressional Debate, and I have 16 career bids to the TOC. Last year, I finaled NSDA Nationals and TOC as a sophomore, and I have won national circuit tournaments like Blue Key twice, season opener twice, and Sunvite just once. And I am the president of my team now for my 4th term. So let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to talk about in this lecture. Just as an overview, we're first going to talk about national circuit tournaments, what they are, what the championships are, what the bids are. Then we'll talk about general tournament strategy on how to make it to elimination rounds and finals. Round strategy, some of the minutiae of what you should be doing. We're going to talk about general tips for speech structure, argumentation, and evidence, and then some notes on questioning. As an overall note, all of this is intended to guide you towards the direction you should be going in for National Circuit Congress. Congress is a very diverse event. Even across the national circuit, there are different norms, different things that are expected of you. But I can't say that anything I'm going to teach you in this slideshow is applicable to every state league, to every local league. You may have different rules, different norms, different customs, but generally, when it comes to bid tournaments, national circuit tournaments, and national championships, this is sound advice. So first, what even is the Natcirc? Well, the national circuit is just any tournament where you can compete no matter where you are in the country. And generally, we understand Natcirc tournaments as national tournaments where you can earn bids to the Tournament of Champions or any other national championships like the NSDA National Championship or the NCFL Championship. So let's talk about bid tournaments. You need to go to bid tournaments to qualify to the Tournament of Champions, and to qualify, you got to get 2 bids. So there is a tier list that the University of Kentucky has published for different competitions that give out bids. There are a lot of tournaments that give out just 6 bids to the top placing competitors. There are some tournaments like Nova, Katie Taylor, Cypress Bay, Bronx, Princeton that give out 16 bids to the finalists. There are 5 competitions, including Emory, Sunvite, Yale, Glenbrooks, and Blue Key, that give out 60 bids to semifinalists. And there is a single tournament that gives out a whopping 120 bids to all tournament quarterfinalists, and that is just Harvard. So let's talk about TOC. I think TOC is the quintessential national circuit championship. You get there by qualifying, by winning 2 bids at Natcirc tournaments, and we're going to expand on that later on. Generally, TOC is understood as the most flow or the most technical Congress tournament, where you're expected to have very sound argumentation, more so in comparison to the other championships. Then we have NSDA Nationals, which is basically the official national championship run by the National Speech and Debate Association. You get there by qualifying, and you do so by competing in your NSDA district qualifying tournament, where you can compete in House or in Senate. Just to expand on that, every district that is big enough has a House division where a certain number of kids qualify based on how many people are competing. So it is an inherently proportional qualification system for House. Meanwhile, in Senate, every district sends 2 no matter what. Then at the national tournament, those 2 divisions compete separately. Generally, House is a bit larger, Senate is a bit smaller. Neither is understood as being more difficult or easier or more technical than the other. They're kind of just distinct. They each have a champion, they each have their own final rounds. The Senate is a bit shorter, simply because it has fewer competitors, simply because it qualifies fewer competitors. And finally, NCFL Nationals. I would really just call the 3rd national championship. It's the odd one out. You compete in this one by qualifying at your Catholic Forensic League Grand Final tournament. A lot of local leagues don't have this, or they don't run off of a CFL. A lot do. you may very well compete at local tournaments run by a Catholic Forensic League, and if you do, they have a grand final tournament where the top few in Congress compete at NCFL Nationals at the end of the year. On the continuum between TOC, NSDA, and NCFL, this one could probably be called the most lay-focused one, where the judges are looking more for a performance than for a strictly technically well-executed debate. To put that into perspective, at TOC, the event is called Congressional Debate. At NSDA and NCFL, it's called Student Congress. Not as much emphasis on debate, more emphasis on role play and advocacy. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the easiest bid tournaments? Time, money, and geography are constricting factors for everyone. So the real answer is it depends. As for individual tournaments where it is really the easiest to qualify, I would say that Harvard has got to be on that list. Yes, usually they do have a massive competitor pool, typically ranging between 300 to 400 congressional debaters. It does give out the most bids at 120, which goes to everyone who qualifies to the quarterfinal rounds by breaking out of prelims. I would say this is one of the easiest bid tournaments because it tends to have easier competition pools overall. It's not just national circuit tryhards pulling up to Harvard, it's everyone and their mother. And to be honest, that drags down the difficulty of the medium competitor down a bit, making it easier to break to elimination rounds and get your bid. In comparison, top 60 tournaments like Sunvite or Glenbrooks are also very common, very popular choices for getting your bids because they have a greater proportion of competitors that get bids. So Sunvite, Glenbrooks, and other top 60 tournaments like Yale tend to range between 100 to 150 competitors, of which usually the top half or 1/3 qualify to semifinals and get a bid. Now, this gets a lot more dependent on your geography because there are a lot of local top 16 tournaments like Nova Titan in South Florida, UT Longhorn in Texas, or the Bronx Invitational in New York, where relatively speaking, it could be a lot easier to qualify and get your bid. For example, at Nova Titan, there may have been 50 competitors, but at Bronx there were 22. They're at the same rank. They give out the same number of bids. It is comparatively easier to qualify at the Bronx Invitational if you're from New York than at Nova Titan if you're from Florida. So there's a lot of bid tournaments. The real answer is watch out for tournaments in your area that give out a lot of bids in comparison to the competitors. And of course, if you are in a particularly difficult region of the country, let's say you share a district with Plano, you might be doing a bit more traveling to get your bids because Texas and California are going to be especially competitive environments for bids. They deserve more. UK doesn't give them. Sorry. A lot of people fly to the East Coast for the easiest and most abundant bid tournaments. Now, let's talk a bit more about tournament strategy. Getting a bid always involves breaking out of prelims at a tournament, which means we're going to be talking mostly about what you can do to improve your chances of breaking out of prelims. And most of this is just stuff I'm going to cover in round strategy, of being a good congressional debater, generally speaking. But often the big question on everyone's mind is, should I preside in prelims or elimination rounds? And the answer is yes, you definitely can. It is a very low risk, medium reward way to get good ranks to try and advance to the next round. So I gave you some examples of ranks I got from POing and prelims. Count yourself lucky if you get ranks as high as 3. Don't be surprised if you get ranks like 9s. A lot of judges don't care that much about POs. You're kind of just rolling the dice here, and generally speaking, you will get decent results. Of course, assuming that you're a good PO. If you don't know how to PO, prelims at a Natcirc tournament probably shouldn't be your first time trying it out. If you're not confident in your POing abilities, you might not want to stake an important break round on it. So these are just some examples of middling ranks that you might tend to expect from being a presiding officer. The reason that POs tend to do relatively well is that they are consistent. POs are necessary for a round. A lot of the time, tournaments will literally encourage their judges not to drop the PO and tell them, remember that this person is necessary to run the round. They're not a speaker, but without them, nothing could function. It's kind of unfair just to drop them for performing this service and this duty for the round. So most judges tend to toss them a decent rank. Some judges don't really care, or they'll be especially critical of POs who make simple mistakes and use it as a reason to give them a low rank like a 9. Isham asks, are there tournaments that favor POs like Harvard and Emory? That's a good question. This probably used to be more of a distinction in the past when everyone was coming back from COVID, because I remember tournament directors like Adam Jacoby pulling up to judge lounge, both in person and virtual, and is literally telling judges, rank your POs, don't give them 9s. And if you have the guarantee that you're not going to get 9s, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable about POing these kinds of rounds. There's a lot less risk involved. But I think that the extremes of doing poorly as a PO or doing extremely well as a PO are starting to buff out. We've seen a lot of incredibly good and a lot of incredibly poor PO performances and rankings, even though the PO has a pretty predictable task at previous tournaments. Harvard and Emory, still good tournaments to PO at in prelims because they tend to have good judges and they have clear communication between Tab and their judges. But it's not like you should PO at Harvard and you shouldn't PO at Bronx. POs tend to do well across the board. Now, a really interesting question is, oops, you made it to finals, congratulations. Should you PO in finals? And the answer is, it's complicated. So 3 things to keep in mind. POs do tend to do well with big panels because of consistency. Keep in mind that you will always get your ranks relative to how other people have been placed. Speakers are inherently polarizing. Judges like different things about speakers. The person who wins the tournament usually ends up getting a 1 and a 9 from a big panel. There tends to be a judge that loves them, and there tends to be a judge that hates them, and everything in between. For POs, it can be a lot more consistent because they have a very simple task. And as long as they do it well, judges will tend to favor them. Look at Parker DeDecker's scores from serving as the presiding officer in 2022 House Finals. 1, 7, 4, 6, 2, 9, 3, 6, 1. Those are absolutely the kind of ranks that you win a tournament that has a big panel with. Because look, only a single 9. If there's only a single judge that thinks you didn't deserve to be ranked in that round, that's looking really, really well for you. Not only that, but Parker got 2 1s from judges that thought the presiding officer deserved to be the person to win the tournament. And that is kind of because of part 2. POs are critical to the round, and a lot of judges want to compensate or arguably overcompensate them for that. It is really difficult for a judge to countenance giving a PO a non-breaking rank or a rank that wouldn't place. But third, this is also something to keep in mind, and probably the reason why POs don't win at most tournaments. POs are objectively nowhere near as impressive as speakers. At the end of the day, it comes down to recognizing speakers effectively, keeping time well, having good discipline, having good endurance, and banging a gavel down against the table at an appropriate volume. Challenging, yes. Exhausting, yes. Is it as skillful as giving an incredibly good speech? Probably not. And a lot of judges will think that way and reflect it in their ranks. That being said, there are a lot of tournaments where there is a 2-part super session in finals instead of just a single final round. In this case, it absolutely can be very strategic to run to be the presiding officer in one session and speak in the next, because you will have the consistency and non-polarizing ranks of being a PO factored into your judge's thought process, as well as potentially being an outstanding speaker. A lot of the time, I see people pretty much guarantee themselves a place in the top 6 at this rate, and very frequently just win first. So if you're going to a super session, I would say it is more strategic to PO than just in a normal final round. Groove asks, is there a guide to POing that new debaters can use? Yes, there is, and I will drop that guide in the chat here after the lecture. Probably just remind me again at the end of it, and I'll send it. Okay, now that we've covered POing in the grand scheme of tournament strategy, let's talk about round strategy as a speaker. So first of all, one thing that I would encourage to everyone is to flow your rounds. I've gone back and forth on this. There are some tournaments where I've decided not to flow, some tournaments where I have decided to flow. I've settled on flowing for every single round of every tournament because it is really, really useful to keep track of what's going on. Flowing is simple. You take notes on what each debater says on each side, making notes of the important stuff, keeping track to yourself who spoke on what side. This is also a great way to write down your question, which I think is highly recommendable because you don't want to have a good question and then forget it. There on the right is an example of one of my parliamentarians who basically typed her flow directly into the ballot and then submitted it along with the feedback. So there are a few different ways to flow. Just the main point is that you want to keep track, think critically, make notes, and have record of what people say. Personally, I flow on my legal pad next to me with, pen and paper. But you could also make a table in Google Docs. There are different things you could do. You can write in shorthand to make it quicker. You can highlight arguments that you think are especially important or that you plan to engage with in your speech. You can graph things to yourself or make note of important things like key clashes in the margins. Especially in tournaments like TOC or techie tournaments, you will be rewarded for having speeches that really reflect your position in the round rather than just giving a good performance. At that point, you need to be a debater, and we can go way more in depth than this, and we won't, but your speech needs to serve its purpose in a round, and unless you're keeping track of the rest of the round, you just can't do that. So I'd recommend flowing. Next, don't bite off more than you can chew. This is one issue that a lot of novice Congress debaters pick up early in their careers. Once you understand how to make good arguments, you have good argument generation, you can come up with a lot of arguments, you can see what's happening. It can be really easy to fill your speech up with all the things that you want to do instead of exercising discretion. And what you want to do is recognize the most important parts of your speech, think carefully about what you can do with your time and how you want to use it effectively, rather than spreading yourself too thin and accomplishing nothing on any front. So to do that, I think there are 3 big rules of thumb. One, think about the clashes. This is a very typical way for people to think of their mid to late round speeches. If you want to give a rebuttal speech or a crystallization speech, usually that's going to be centered on what people have already been arguing about instead of introducing something new. That is a great way to see if an argument is inherently relevant to the debate and already important to the judges. A great way to stay relevant and to take on a straightforward, manageable goal is to win a clash for your side or try to prove an important argument within it. Second, if there are unresolved questions in the debate, in a clash, it can be very valuable for a speaker to recognize those questions, answer them, and show where the debate leads from there. This is a very natural progression. You are pretty much guaranteed to have original, constructive material that is not rehash and that advances the debate. Third, and finally, if there's just generally a big misconception underlying everything in the round, if you want to reframe something critical, this is a great way to wipe out a lot of speeches with a single valuable point. that reframes something, repositions your argument, introduces something that just totally outweighs everything else. Something like this is a great way to turn the round on its head and just stand out as a speaker. Point being, you can engage with the debate on a lot of different scales, but you want to do it in a very deliberate and focused way. You don't want to engage with every argument that has been made so far on a line-by-line level. Line by line makes sense in policy, LDNPF. It does not make sense in Congress, an event where you have 3 minutes of speaking time to engage with a dozen other speakers. You need to pick your battles. Emily Lynn asks if crystallization speeches should just rely on other speakers' evidence or have some of their own. This is a fantastic question. I think that in theory, you can give a good Congress speech with no evidence. I don't think you should try it. Put another way, I think that all Congress speeches should have some sort of original argument, something constructive at the core of them to advance the debate. I don't think you can convincingly win a round of Congress and earn a judge's one only by repurposing and reframing what other people have said. It is critical that you introduce something new and original to advance the debate, to reframe the debate, rather than just trying to tally up all the arguments on other people's sides and weighing. You're not introducing anything. You're just trying to wrap up the debate in a platter and give it to your judge. Those are useful skills, but a good Congress speech amounts to more than that. It can be fine to extend other people's evidence sparingly. It can save you a lot of time, but you always want to introduce something novel. Now, let's talk about preset recency. This is something relatively new on the circuit. A lot of tournaments have been experimenting with creating a preset recency for competitors, where instead of having the original list be random and the PO just picks speakers who stand for the first speech or the first question indiscriminately. Instead, to make it more equitable and to eliminate PO bias, tournaments are publishing an order in which speakers are assumed to have already spoken and that the recency is preset. This can be really annoying if you end up right at the very bottom of the preset recency list, like, for example, I did in Nats Finals. So if you're in my place and you're the dead last in preset recency of Nats Finals, you should not be scrambling and getting up every time to give your sponsorship or early round constructed speech. You are in it for the long game. So if your name is down there at the 11th preset recency rank in a room of 12 people, prepare yourself to give a speech late in the round, especially if you know that other people are prepped out. This just gives you a lot of time and flexibility to work on the speech that you're going to give rather than scrambling by the seat of your pants to adjust your speech for every point of the round. You can take the long game, the middle game, or the short game, depending on where you know your preset recency is. This is just a better use of your time and gives you more time to be deliberate. Dhruv asks, is there any way we can know where we rank on these lists? If a tournament is using preset recency, you will usually see that list posted along with your pairings on Tabroom. And if you can't find it anywhere, they're probably just using randomness. I think most tournaments are still using randomness, but preset recency is beginning to kind of become a norm on the national circuit. So it's good to know how to plan around it. It is used at tournaments like Nationals, Harvard, I believe, TOC, and a couple of other big invitationals. Now, let's talk about judge adaptation. I think I have a bit of an unconventional take on this. I think that people overstate the importance of judge adaptation in Congress. That's because we don't really have a lay and tech schism that events like PF or LD or policy do. Congress is fundamentally the same event everywhere. That's because it is inherently an event revolving around lay judges. What do normal people want from their representatives? Congress is all about the common man and appealing to the common man. That's why it's very appropriate that parent judges or lay people judge most of our competitions. If we can't convince normal people, what good is our speech? So that means that our judges universally value some important stuff like clear structure, clearly good and important argumentation. Solid delivery skills are valued across the board. You can never win a tournament by just staring at your pad, and having a coherent, deliberate, and creative line of rhetoric. Flow judges like all of that only because they enjoy what they think other lay judges should enjoy, which means that they might take it a step further. They might understand your argumentation more. They might be more informed. They might be more aware of the tactics, and they might give you more specific feedback on how to improve. But at their heart, they're not tabula rasa policy judges. No one is going to reward you for spreading. So that being said, don't overcompensate on what makes you a good speaker. Don't compromise on your style just because you think you have a lay judge or a flow judge. Also, pro tip, if you care especially about what your judge's personal beliefs are, which if they're going to tell you about it, you should probably be wary, look your judges up on LinkedIn. You might find out some valuable stuff. If they work for the National Park Service, you might want to go AF on that bill to ban fracking. That's useful information you have that other speakers might not, and it can make or break your rounds. Mira asks, how can we improve on our rhetoric and coming up with attention-getting devices? So I think this is all about your inspiration and how you come up with material. Personally, I find that my best jokes and my best one-liners come to me during the round. I just can't come up with that sort of stuff, sitting at my desk at 9 p.m. when I know I have school the next morning. I have to have the caffeine flowing through me, forced to give my speech in 30 minutes, got to come up with something now. That being said, a lot of rhetoric I do come up with in the context of media I consume. So if you want to come up with clever Congress rhetoric, watch political dramas or legal dramas or anything like that, because there are entire staffs of writers out there who are supposed to inform millions of Americans who watch TV on the same sort of material that you're going to be speaking out to Congress judges. It could be nice to take a page out of their book. And, whether you're watching The West Wing or Boston Legal or Veep, they have interesting material which you can take notes on. Moving on, let's take some notes on structure and argumentation. I'm not going to dive into the details of block structure, but this is probably the most common speech structure on the national circuit. So in a speech, first you talk about the status quo, what's going on in the world right now, what's happening, what's the problem, what's good about the world. Then you talk about the solvency, where you always want to tie it back to the bill or to the policy and action that's being debated. You want to talk about how does the bill change the status quo and how. You want to explain the mechanisms, you want to explain why it changes, how it changes. And then the impact explains why that's better or worse. Of course, if you're an affirmation speech, you're going to be saying that the bill might solve a problem in the status quo, and the benefit of that is your impact. Or if you're a negation speaker, you might talk about why something is already bad in the status quo, how the bill actually makes it worse, and why that's a negative impact compared to the affirmation. Dhruv asks, the issue I have with block structure is that it's clear how it works on the aff, but it doesn't really make sense for the negation. With solvency, okay, yeah, I see where you can get lost along the way because it's like, oh, solvency is the bill's ability to make change. But the bill is a two-edged sword. It changes things for better or for worse. And if you're going to be using block structure as a negation speaker, you're going to be talking about how the bill changes things for the worse. Yana asks, do you have to prove a net harm for solvency on the negation? Yes, that's a good way to put it. Generally, as a speaker, you want to be creating offense for your side by saying that either we're making the world better as an affirmation speaker or we're making it worse as a negation speaker. So, Yana, yes, you generally want to prove as a negation speaker that the policy action will make things worse and will have a net harm. Dhruv continues, if I'm saying that the change is bad in my solvency, what do I have in my impact? So don't think too much about the impact itself in your solvency. You want to talk about what the bill changes and how it affects the status quo. So if I'm talking about a bill to fund law enforcement, and I'm saying that, oh, law enforcement is already bad in the status quo, that could be my explanation of status quo. My solvency block could be saying, you know, this bill gives police departments money which they're going to spend on things which are bad for the community, like hiring more police officers or militarizing their police departments more. And that's your solvency. It doesn't have a explicit spelled out negative impact, but it does lead into it. Your impact block, where you say that militarized police have poor relationships with their communities, have higher rates of police brutality, and are more likely to be racially discriminatory. So that is the difference between having a kind of neutral solvency block in a negative speech leading into your decidedly negative, harmful impact. Mira asks, what are your thoughts on performing a non-standard structured speech like all clash or a three-point speech? If it works, yeah. There really aren't any rules or requirements for Congress structure. People have become a lot more experimental. Personally, I don't really write my speeches at all along the lines of block structure. I kind of freestyle it. I don't recommend that to people because there are certain things you want to be doing in a speech, and having a certain structure is a good way to go about accomplishing those goals. That being said, there are a couple of things I definitely wouldn't recommend. Do not have a speech that is all line by line. Having a speech that is all clash or all refutation is good, but it has to be focused on a particular argument. You want to be grouping together warrants, grouping together impacts, tying up multiple speakers on one side together, and addressing their arguments as a whole. So that ties into the principle you don't want to refute speakers as much as you want to refute arguments themselves. A three-point speech, people have done well with it. It's not recommendable because generally that just means you're biting off more than you can chew. I would sooner just recommend a one-point speech because rounds of Congress can be won on a single clash or a single debate if it is won decisively. If you are splitting up your 3 minutes, perhaps really 2 minutes and 30 seconds of content across three different arguments, you have to be very careful about whether you're giving yourself enough time to develop any of those arguments to be meaningfully impactful or significant in the round in the first place. So think about that. Nidhi asks, what should be the ratio between talking about the status quo, the solvency, or the impact? If you're a late round speaker, should there be any explanation of the status quo? Don't think too hard about the ratio. This is not the sort of thing where it's like, oh, 1/3 of the time should be for status quo, 1/3 for solvency, 1/3 for impact. This isn't about the division of time. This is about the order in which you do it. Your solvency mechanism could be really, really straightforward. And partially to answer your second question, if you're speaking later in the round and you're accepting the understanding of the status quo, you might not need to talk about it that much, or perhaps even at all. It's just there to guide your thought process and think, okay, is my argument dependent on a different understanding of the status quo compared to what other people have said? But to narrow in on that question, as a late round speaker, should I be re-explaining the status quo? Again, depends on what you're doing. If you are addressing a misconception in the round, like about the status quo, yeah, you have to. But if your speech is more focused on refuting an argument in an understanding of the status quo that you accept, no, you might not have to. This structure shouldn't be tying you down. It should just be giving you, guide rails for how to prepare your speech. Mira asks, what are the key things to include in your structure when freestyling? Um, well, if we're talking about freestyling, it means that there really isn't much that you absolutely need to have in your speech. It all depends on the context, but you absolutely need to have an introduction, preferably a rhetorical narrative, where your introduction ties all the way back to your conclusion, and that narrative is somehow relevant to your argument. If you're speaking pretty much any time past the first cycle, you should have clash. And like I said, I think all Congress speeches should have some sort of constructive original material. Gognato asks, what about a structure of half ref and half constructive for mid or later round speeches? This is fine. That, however, is not incompatible with block structure. Both of those can kind of use this structure. Your constructive argument, of course, can be clear for how this is used, and refutation speeches could be focused on just taking this, but clashing with someone else's interpretation of the status quo or the solvency or the impact. Maybe you say the status quo is the opposite, so you reverse the argument. Or you say the bill does the opposite of something that the other speaker says, so you reverse the argument. Or you say the impact is actually good, not bad, so you reverse the argument. All of those would be examples of different turns. Dhruv asks, what are some useful resources to figure out the clash on some builds? There have been builds that I research and I'm just not able to get the main point. Well, pretty much every bill has something you can research to find out more about it. If you can't come up with arguments, read more, do more research. If you can't find any arguments about the specific policy action itself, try to get a bit more creative and think of arguments about what you know about society and how things might change in response to the bill, in which case your research would be focused on explaining those parameters. For a bill on paid maternity leave, for example, you might research things like parent debt or the impact of debt or social mobility. And these things aren't necessarily unique to paid parental leave, but they're all relevant. Mira asks, do you have a document of good common jargon and or rhetoric to use in speeches? I keep a massive table of all the lines of rhetoric I have used in my speeches, and I categorize it so that if I ever want to use something, I might be able to come back to it. Sorry, you can't have it. I really would not recommend canning anything because the more speeches in which you can use jargon or rhetoric, the worse that rhetoric is. It should be specific to the circumstances of the bill, of the debate, even of your environment or the tournament location, because otherwise it's not memorable and it's not creative. Leonie asks, how long should the research process be, especially when there's multiple builds? That depends entirely on you and how you want to use your time. Personally, I don't prep every tournament in the docket. I try to figure out which builds will be debated and which builds won't be debated. After that, I usually don't write out full speeches, but I do some basic research, come up with arguments, have evidence at my disposal, and have some ideas for rhetoric, so I can assemble my speech in round once I start seeing what the round is like, what other people are talking about, and focus more on adapting my content to that as I create my speech. Noam asks, what structure should I use for an authorship speech? Definitely block structure. Block structure is a very, very good way to talk about the issues of the world, why we should have policy to solve it, why that policy is good. Those are your three main jobs. That's exactly what block structure does. Mira asks, what are some drills to get faster at prepping? You can give yourself 20 minutes to prep a speech on a bill, challenge yourself to write a speech in that time, see how good it is, repeat, give yourself another 20 minutes, and so on. So you feel the pressure of a time constraint to write a speech, see how good of a product you come up with, and then continue to expand on that. Asham asks, do you ever prep out full sponsors, or do you prep that in round as well? Yes. If I want to give a sponsorship or an authorship speech, you got to write it beforehand. There simply isn't enough time to prep that out. I mean, in the time between sitting down in your seat and giving the speech. Okay. I'm going to have to cut the questions here. We're going to continue with the lecture and we'll have time towards the end for questions. Okay. Let's talk about clarity. Clarity is, in my opinion, one of the most important speeches in Congress. Your arguments mean nothing to judges if they don't understand them. And a lot of beginning national circuit debaters will have a ton of different ideas whizzing around their heads about what their argument should be and why it's so brilliant. They might even articulate it pretty well, but what they'll struggle with is actually making it clear to judges what they're saying. And there are a couple of ways to fix this. First of all, you want to signpost. You want to tell your judges what you're telling them. Before you tell them that fossil fuel companies are going to offshore all of their business to other countries because carbon taxes are placing too much financial pressure on them. Before you dump all of that on them, say carbon taxes will make companies offshore their business to other countries. Here's why. And then you explain yourself. You also want to have clear transitions. Judges love it when you tell them when you're moving from one thing to another. Think between status quo, solvency, impact. It can be as clear as, okay, first, what's the issue in the status quo? Moving on, how does this bill solve that? Third of all, why is that so important? That sounds so basic, but it gives your judges flags to work with to identify your arguments and why they matter in conjunction to each other. You also want to signal important things like weighing or impacting. Like, let's weigh the importance of preventing climate change to the negation's argument about offshoring, and then you do your weighing. Or you want to explain why something is so important before you give us the impact itself. And finally, I think this is something you want to do in every speech. You want to fit the thesis of your speech into a single sentence at the end of your introduction before the content of your speech. If you can boil your entire speech down into one sentence, it should be this. And it should give your judge the entire overview of what you're going to be talking about. There is nothing in your speech that you want to be leaving out from your thesis. You don't want to be introducing some groundbreaking, round-winning argument in the last 30 seconds of your speech that your judge wasn't prepared to hear. Don't take them on a wild goose chase. Let them know what you're going to tell them, and then tell them. Mira asks, if you signpost, do you need to repeat the first tagline afterwards? And in your taglines, do you recommend saying, well, I don't know. You don't need to be formulaic about it. Just ask yourself if you're being clear. And when you're introducing a new argument, signpost what that argument is first. Don't give us a roadmap. Don't dump onto your judges just everything you're going to be doing. Make it succinct. Be careful about your word economy. Don't take up too much time. This is really important. Even if you don't care about what you're debating out about, get good at pretending you do. Because if you're getting up there with your suit and tie, with your legal pad, and your judges have been dragged here by their kids to judge at this tournament, they do not want to hear you speak off of your pad, talking about war crimes in Saudi Arabia, wishing you would rather be at home playing FIFA. It is miserable for the judges. They will drop you. So you do want to speak with conviction. And the first thing you can do, which you should be doing anyways, is memorize your intro and conclusion. No matter what the speech is, memorize it. It helps, especially if you're a big beginner debater and you feel more passionately about one side or the other, speak on the side you personally agree with. If you have that luxury, it'll make you care more about the debate. Third, you want to put an emotional emphasis on impacts. Don't just give us this clinical link chain and say, oh, by the way, 1.2 billion people are going to die. Fail. Like, whoa, that's crazy. Talk about how terrible that is for a moment and make it clear to the judges how stunning, how terrible, how catastrophic, how depressing it is. And that's where your rhetoric comes in. And finally, avoid using jargon. Do not use debate terminology like link turn, even solvency, or warrant. These terms are not used in everyday language, and remember that your speeches are intended to be accessible to everyday people. If you use the words of the trade, they might just not get you, and you don't want your speech to be lost in translation. Okay, some notes on evidence. I think this is really important, and a lot of people slack off when it comes to credibility or to research, and judges may not comment on it, but I guarantee you it can make the difference between breaking and not breaking. Judges love good evidence. You want to cite a source, you want to use a good source, you want to at least give us the month and year of publication, preferably the day as well. If the author's qualifications are relevant, tell us about the qualifications. If the source itself doesn't sound that credible, but it comes from a good author, don't just, cite Reddit or Quora or whatever. Cite the author themselves. They might have a lot more to say than the platform itself does. And another important thing, never quote. Put everything in your own words, and this will help you for two reasons. First of all, written language is written to sound good when it's read, not when it is heard out loud. If you simply quote text directly from a news article and put it into your speech, and then try to speak it out loud, it's going to mess up the flow of your speech. Not only that, but you are going to be unfamiliarized with it. If you can synthesize that content and put it in your own words, you will have thought about it carefully and it will come out in your own voice. It will sound much more authentic. And second, they are unsummarized. Pretty much whenever you quote, you are spending about 3 or 4 times as much time on that citation as you need to be. Give us the gist of it. Save time. And finally, make yourself sound credible. Don't just cite Kathy Quick and Guillermo Narvaez. Make sure you tell us that it's coming from a study of the University of Minnesota. Or if it's just a study by the University of Minnesota, why should we care? I'm sure just about anyone could get a source out there into the world and cite it in a Congress speech. You want to be specific about your credibility. And I think a really good rule of thumb for this is if a judge hears your citation in your speech, can they plug that basic info into the Google search bar and find the source that you're referring to? If not, you should be a bit more thorough with your citation, and this helps with your ethos, with your credibility. It makes your arguments more believable. And again, if judges don't believe or understand your arguments, they count for nothing. Finally, let's talk a little bit about questioning. What should you be doing with questioning? Questioning has 3 purposes, and this is when it comes to direct cross-examination, 30-second blocks of back and forth. First of all, you want to break down arguments in the other person's speech. That's clear enough, but remember, that doesn't mean building up your own arguments or building up their arguments. Don't use that time to give a 30-second speech of their own. Don't use that time to help your own side. You want to use that time being critical and breaking down arguments in a deliberate way. Second, you want to be setting up your own speech. If you can get out concessions from your opponent about the nature of their argument or about their evidence, you can set up about your own speech. You can say, Senator Ostheimer admitted to me in cross-examination that blank. This makes sense when we consider blank. And you can set yourself up for a home run of an argument in the long run. Third, and kind of least relevantly, you can demonstrate your own personality. Cross-examination time is the only time that you will be interacting directly with another person in debate in Congress. That could be a good time to pull off some humor, to clash directly with someone else and demonstrate perhaps that you are performing better than they are, instead of just giving speeches for the judges to compare on their own initiative. So it's a great way just to clash with other people, not just as debaters, but as individuals, that at the end of the day, the judge is going to be giving a rank. So let's break down some things that you should and shouldn't do. You should ask short questions. Don't spend too much time asking a question. Don't spend more than 10 seconds on a question. If you're spending more than 10 seconds on a question, it's too complicated. You increase the risk of your opponent not understanding and asking you to repeat it, pretty much burning your entire cross-ex time, and you risk your judges not understanding it in the first place. Accordingly, you want to ask leading questions. You want to ask something simple that they can agree with, or give you a simple yes or no answer to, or give you a straightforward statistic. Then you want to use that question to ask another question that you have set up, which capitalizes on that concession. You do not want to interrupt the other person. Interrupting the other person is just straight up a violation of decorum. There are no judges that appreciate it. Doesn't matter if you win the block. You really just risk not being understood. And even if you are understood, there are so many judges that will just rank you straight down for it. You might want to finish the time. You might want to squeeze something in. You might have something simple to say. Resist the temptation. Don't interrupt. So kind of in the theme of asking short questions or leading questions, you want to plan out a line of questioning and have a goal in mind for your questioning block. What concession do I want to get from the speaker? And how am I going to get it out from them in a way that they aren't going to expect? If you lay it all on them with a single question and ask, oh, how does your point still stand? There are so many ways for a good debater to wriggle out of that question, give you some nonsense, waffle for 15 seconds, or even see what you're getting at and give you a good answer, and you're pretty much guaranteed to kind of have a wash of a questioning block. Especially against talented congressional debaters and tough rounds where you're concerned about breaking or making it to finals or placing, you want to outsmart them. You can't just put an argument on the table and ask them to explain themselves. Be deliberate. And finally, I really recommend writing your questions down during their speech so you can keep track of it, make note of it. A lot of the time, I have one or two or even different 3 lines of questioning that I have in mind for a speaker, and I write them all down on my flow, and I choose one by the time I get up to stand. 3 final don'ts. Very, very generally, don't preface, even though you're allowed to indirect cross-ex. It takes up too much time, you risk confusion, your opponent might disagree with you, and if any of those things happen, you've kind of wasted your time on introducing something constructive and new in your block. But if you can bring up a very concise statistic or argument, especially if it has already been brought up in the round, that can be fine. But be careful. Just, if you can do it without prefacing, do it without prefacing. Second, do not use your time to just make an argument of your own or set up something constructive. You might even give away what the point of your speech is going to be and give other people in the room an idea of how to prepare for it. Don't telegraph your decisions and your actions to the rest of the room. And finally, do not ask your own side friendly questions. It's not only really annoying, but it doesn't do much for you. You don't just want to throw them softballs and have them say, yes, the affirmation or the negation is so great. I'm so glad that both of us are going to vote for it. There are a lot of judges who find it insufferable, and if they don't, they just won't really care. It's a waste of your time, and it's also a waste of other people's time. Zaid asks, should you be at the top of the questioning list, or is it all right to ask an average amount of questions? My advice is ask as many questions as possible, but make sure they're good questions. Every question you ask is an additional impression on the judges. So you want to ask as many questions as you want for the same reason that you want to give as many speeches as you want. Anything you miss out on is as a missed chance to impress the judges. Dhruv asks, what's prefacing? Prefacing is when you bring up new statistics or arguments or evidence in a questioning block and use it as the basis of a question. You can ask questions without prefacing just by working off of what they said in their speech. Dhruv asks, someone at my tournament won first after asking my side questions, but those questions mainly enforced his point, not that side's point. Is it still a don't? Yes, it's still a don't. If you have a good point, you will have reinforced it enough in your speech. If you're at a good tournament, people will probably be refuting you, and you want to save your questioning time to re-engage with their questions rather than just using your own side as a stepping stone to set yourself up even further. Honestly, there is no circumstance where it's strategic to use to ask your own side friendly questions. Just don't do it. Okay, that is it. Thank you all very much for attending this lecture.